In a hotel hallway in Washington, D.C., an 8-year-old girl walks beside an adult man. It's the kind of grainy surveillance clip that shouldn't feel important until you realize it might be the last time she's ever seen. And the most chilling part is this. When that footage was recorded, the people who loved her most still didn't know she was missing. Before we get into the timeline, I want you to stay with me until the end, because this case isn't only about a disappearance. It's about how a child can slip through multiple safety nets in plain sight, and how a few small, not-my-job moments can add up to something irreversible. By the end, I'll lay out the clearest, fact-based sequence we have, and the exact points where the story breaks down. Her name is Relisha Rudd. She was a little girl in Washington, D.C., living with her family inside a system that was supposed to be temporary, emergency shelter, until life stabilized. She had a school. She had teachers. She had routines. And she had people around her every day. But she also had vulnerability wrapped around her life in ways a lot of people never have to think about. When a family is unhoused, privacy disappears. Safe boundaries get harder to enforce. You're forced to trust strangers, staff, security, contractors, other residents, because they're everywhere all the time. If you've ever wondered how cases like this happen, here's the question to keep in your mind. When so many adults are nearby, how does no one notice the moment a child is taken out of her own life? Relisha was living with her mother and siblings at a large family shelter in D.C. The details matter here, not because anyone deserves blame for being poor, but because poverty changes the geometry of risk. It creates more points of contact with strangers and fewer options to say no when someone offers help. And that's where Kahlil Tatum enters the story, a man who worked at the shelter as a janitor. He wasn't a teacher, not a counselor, not a doctor, but according to public reporting and investigators' accounts, he managed to position himself as someone the family could rely on. That's one of the most difficult truths in this case. The person who allegedly got closest to Relisha wasn't some shadowy figure from outside. He was already inside the building. Think about the kind of trust that can form in a place like a shelter. If you're a parent juggling survival, finding work, keeping kids fed, making appointments, dealing with transportation, someone who offers help can feel like a rope thrown to a drowning person. You're not thinking in terms of perfect choices. You're thinking in terms of making it through the week. So now let's anchor the timeline, because the timeline is where this case becomes both clearer and more disturbing. Relisha was a student. Her absence from school becomes one of the first visible warning lights. But in the beginning, an absence doesn't automatically read as a crisis. Kids get sick. Families move. Transportation fails. Life happens. The problem is how long those absences went on, and how the explanations around them started to sound official, even when they weren't. According to investigators and later reporting, doctors' notes were used to explain why Relisha wasn't in class. But they weren't real medical documentation. One of the most infamous details in this case is that the notes were allegedly signed with a name that looked legitimate at a glance, Dr. Tatum. Pause right there. I want to know what you think, based on what we've covered so far. If you're a teacher or a school staff member and you see a note signed Dr. Tatum, what's your next move? Do you accept it and move on, or do you treat it as a red flag and start verifying immediately? Tell me what you'd do, and what your school would realistically do. Because for investigators, that note becomes a kind of symbol, not just of deception but of access. It suggests someone believed they could impersonate authority and no one would challenge it. As the concern grew, the case begins to shift from a child is missing school to a child may be missing, period. And here's where surveillance footage enters and takes over the story. Investigators were able to locate footage from a hotel showing Relisha with Kahlil Tatum. One confirmed instance places them at a hotel on February 26, 2014. That's not a rumor. That's part of the documented investigative timeline reported publicly. A child and an adult man walking down a hotel hallway, alone, raises a different category of question than a child missing a few days of class. Then there's another date that comes up again and again in this case. March 1, 2014. That date is widely cited in official missing person materials and later reporting as the last confirmed time Relisha was seen, captured on surveillance at a motel in Northeast D.C. So now the story has a hard edge to it. We're not only talking about missed attendance. We're talking about a child physically present with an adult who, according to law enforcement, was believed to be with her. And now we have to talk about the delay, because delay is one of the reasons this case still haunts people. Relisha was reported missing in March 2014. Public sources differ on the exact sequence of when school officials first notified agencies versus when the official missing person report was taken, but the core point doesn't change. She had been out of sight for weeks before the case reached full public urgency. That means something painfully simple. The most crucial window, when a missing child case has the highest chance of a quick recovery, was already closing by the time the alarm bells became impossible to ignore. And once a case hits that point, investigators are no longer searching for a child in motion. They're trying to reconstruct a past that's already cooling. As authorities started closing in on Kahlil Tatum, the story takes a darker turn, one that complicates the investigation and removes the possibility of courtroom answers. During the search for Relisha, investigators tied Tatum to another alleged crime, the death of his wife, Andrea Tatum. A warrant was issued in Prince George's County, Maryland, and the discovery of his wife's body in a motel room became part of the same widening crisis. Now, the investigation isn't only about finding a missing child. It's also about locating a fugitive suspect wanted in connection with a homicide. And here's an unsettling reality. When an investigation becomes that complicated, it can still sharpen the focus, because it creates urgency and resources, but it can also swallow time, spread leads thin, and deepen fear in the community. At this stage, the man believed to be with Relisha was no longer just a person of interest. He was a man authorities were actively trying to find, while simultaneously begging the public for tips. And now the questions multiply. Where was Relisha between February 26th and March 1st? If March 1st is the last confirmed sighting, what happens after that moment, after that door, that hallway, that camera angle, when the record goes silent? What did anyone at the shelter notice, if anything, and when? And who might have had a chance to interrupt this before it reached a point of no return? If you're watching this and you're already forming a theory, here's a comment prompt I want you to answer based on the facts up to this point. Do you believe the key failure here was at the shelter, at the school, or at the agency level after the first concerns were raised? Or do you think it's the combination that made it fatal? Because what makes this case so hard to process is that it doesn't hinge on one single decision. It hinges on a chain. Now let's talk about the shelter environment without turning it into a lecture. This matters because it explains how access can become normal. A shelter is not a private home. There are shared spaces. Staff rotate. Contractors come and go. Residents rely on staff for basic needs, maintenance, safety, communication, sometimes transportation or guidance. Familiarity grows fast because people see each other every day, and familiarity can be mistaken for safety. A janitor is often invisible in the best way, someone who cleans, fixes, maintains. If that person is friendly, helpful, present, it can start to feel like they're part of the community's background. That's exactly why, in a setting like this, background checks and oversight are not optional details, they're life and death policy. As the public learned more about Tatum, it raised another layer of controversy. How was he hired to work around vulnerable families in the first place? That question became part of the wider outrage and the wider grief. Because if the system allows the wrong person into the wrong position, it doesn't just fail once. It fails repeatedly. Every day that person shows up and is treated as safe by default. Now, during the height of the search, law enforcement efforts pushed into parks, neighborhoods, and possible disposal sites. Volunteers searched. The city watched. People held their breath waiting for the moment someone would say, "We found her." But that moment never came. Instead, on April 1st, 2014, authorities announced that Kahlil Tatum had been found dead in the area of Kenilworth Park and Aquatic Gardens in northeast Washington, D.C. And with that discovery, a door slammed shut. Not just on the man himself, but on the possibility of interrogation, confession, cross-examination, trial testimony, any formal process that could force answers into the open. So we're left with an agonizing truth about this case. The person investigators believed was with Relisha was gone, and Relisha was still missing. No matter what you believe happened, that sequence creates a unique kind of pain. It means the most direct source of information, the one person who might know where she is, could no longer be questioned. At this point in the story, I want to ask you something else, and I want you to answer it honestly in the comments. If you were an investigator and the suspect is suddenly gone, what's your next priority? Do you double down on the last known location? Do you focus on associates? Or do you treat it like a long-term cold case immediately? Because different strategies can change what evidence survives. Now I want to slow down and return to Relisha, not just as a name attached to a case file, but as a child. In public photos, she's smiling. She looks like a kid who should be worrying about cartoons and school projects and birthdays. And that contrast between who she was and what the case became is exactly why this story stays with people in D.C. and far beyond it. Her family and community kept searching for her in ways that don't always show up in police reports. Posters, calls, vigils, people talking to people. And that kind of persistence matters, because in long-term missing person cases, renewed attention can be the thing that jogs a memory in someone who didn't realize they mattered. At around the midpoint here, if this breakdown is helping you keep the facts straight, please hit the like button. Not for me, but because more visibility keeps Relisha's name circulating in the places where a real tip can still surface. Now let's talk about what we can say responsibly and what we can't. Law enforcement has publicly stated that they believed Relisha was with Kahlil Tatum. Some reporting goes further and describes investigators' belief about what happened to her. But the crucial point is this: Relisha has never been found, and there was never a trial where evidence could be tested in court. So if you ever hear someone speak about this case with absolute certainty, you should be cautious. The shape of the story strongly suggests a tragic outcome, but a suggestion is not the same thing as a verified conclusion. What we can say with confidence is that the last confirmed sightings place Relisha with Tatum, and that the official search for her continued even after he was found dead. And we can also say something else. The longer a missing child is unaccounted for, the harder it becomes to recover truth, because truth is made of details and details fade. Think about what would matter in the first 24 to 72 hours of a missing child case. Sightings, footage, receipts, messages, witness memories. Now imagine those leads being pursued weeks later. That doesn't mean investigators didn't work hard once the case exploded into public view. It means the case began with a handicap. So where does that leave the timeline? It leaves us with key known points: Relisha's life in the shelter, her absences from school, the alleged use of doctors' notes, the confirmed surveillance footage on February 26th, and the widely cited last confirmed sighting on March 1st. After that, it becomes a search shaped by absence. The hotels and motels matter because they become the last physical trace. In cases like this, a hotel can function like a crossroads, an anonymous place where people can pass through without neighbors noticing routine patterns. That's why surveillance footage is so crucial. It captures movement without needing trust. Cameras don't assume someone is safe. But cameras also have limits. They capture frames, not motives. And they can leave you with the most haunting kind of evidence: proof of presence without proof of what happened next. At the center of this case is a question that many people still ask years later. How did a child end up in a position where a shelter worker could take her to a hotel? That's not a question designed to shame a mother. It's a question designed to interrogate the environment around her. Because when people talk about bad choices, they sometimes ignore the choices people didn't have. If your life is stable, you can insist on strict boundaries and pay the cost of saying no. If your life is unstable, saying no can mean losing help you can't replace. And predators understand that. They don't always use force first. They use proximity. They use patience. They use the appearance of being needed. Now, I want to be very careful here. We can't diagnose someone we've never met. We can't turn this into a psychological profile that pretends to know what was in Tatum's head. But we can describe patterns of exploitation that are well known in child safety work. Grooming often involves building trust with the adults around a child, offering help, creating dependence, and then isolating the child in ways that seem temporarily normal. If you're listening right now and you're thinking, but surely someone would notice, remember, in crowded systems, responsibility can become blurry. Everyone assumes someone else is checking. And in this case, there are multiple institutions that touched Relisha's life: shelter operations, school attendance monitoring, social services, law enforcement. When responsibility is shared, accountability can dissolve. That's why this case became a symbol in D.C., not only of one missing child, but of how quickly a vulnerable child can become invisible. If you've worked in education, social work, or any kind of public-facing service, I want your perspective in the comments on this specific point. What policy change would you make first? Mandatory verification of medical notes, faster escalation for extended absences, stricter shelter staffing rules, or something else entirely? Now let's talk about the official status. Relisha Rudd's case remains open. Her name still appears in official missing person listings. There are age-progressed images created to show what she might look like as she grows older, because in a case without recovery, time itself becomes a suspect. Age progression is both practical and heartbreaking. Practical because it keeps the public looking for the right face. Heartbreaking because it forces you to imagine years passing without answers. And it's not just about one case. Relisha's disappearance also raised broader questions about media attention, about which missing kids become national stories and which remain local heartbreaks. In the years since, organizations focused on missing children, especially missing Black children, have continued pushing cases like this back into the light. Because attention is not a vanity metric in missing person work. Attention is a search tool. And that brings us to the part of this story that's hardest to narrate, the unresolved space. The empty space after the last confirmed sighting. The days after March 1st, when no one can point to a verified image, verified witness, verified location. The months after April 1st, when the person investigators believed was with her was gone. And the years after that, when every anniversary brings the same question. Where is Relisha? People sometimes assume that when time passes, a case goes cold and nothing happens. But cold cases aren't always inactive. Sometimes they're waiting for a new tip, a new piece of technology, a new witness willing to speak, a new connection between cases. Sometimes a case is one phone call away from turning back into a live investigation. And sometimes it isn't. But here's why cases like this still matter to cover. Because truth has a way of surfacing in unexpected ways, especially when the public keeps the details alive. A person who worked at a hotel might remember something small they dismissed at the time. A person who crossed paths with a suspect might recall a vehicle. A person who heard a conversation might remember a name. In everyday life, we file away strange moments as none of my business. In missing person cases, those moments can be the entire case. So if you're listening and you're thinking about your own life, your own "I saw something odd once" memory, ask yourself this. Would you report it if a child was involved, even years later? Or would you assume it's too late? I want to make something clear. Reporting tips is not the same thing as accusing someone. You can report a memory without claiming certainty. Investigators can decide what's relevant. Now, there's also a delicate topic that floats around many missing child cases: trafficking. People often jump to it because it's frightening and because it exists. But we have to separate general fears from case-specific facts. In Relisha's case, the publicly emphasized investigative focus centered on her being with Kahlil Tatum, based on surveillance and other investigative leads. That doesn't erase other possibilities, but it does shape what investigators considered most likely and why. And it brings us back to the harshest question: was Relisha alive after March 1st? We do not have public, verified proof of any sighting after that date that has been confirmed in the way those hotel records were. And that's one of the reasons the case remains so painful. Families in this situation live in a unique tension. Hope can be life-saving, and hope can also be exhausting. Every year that passes becomes a new negotiation between belief and grief. Relisha's family has had to live inside that tension. And so has the community that watched the case unfold. Because when a child disappears from a shelter, the entire idea of safety net feels compromised. If the most vulnerable place is also a place where harm can occur, what does that mean for the people who have nowhere else to go? That's not a rhetorical question. It's a policy question. It's a moral question. And it's a practical one. Now, in more recent years, new efforts have tried to reignite attention. Remembrance gatherings, renewed public appeals, and media projects designed to generate fresh tips. A case being old doesn't mean it's done. It means it needs a new angle of visibility. But visibility also has to be ethical. Relisha isn't a plot twist. She's not a ghost story. She's a person whose life matters regardless of whether the public gets a neat conclusion. So here's what we know, in the most grounded way possible. Relisha Rudd was reported missing in March 2014. Authorities publicly stated they believed she had been with Kahlil Tatum, a shelter janitor, and surveillance footage placed them together at a hotel on February 26th, with March 1st often cited as the last confirmed sighting at a motel in Northeast D.C. During the search, Tatum became wanted in connection with the death of his wife, Andrea Tatum, whose body was discovered in a motel room in Maryland. Then, on April 1, 2014, authorities confirmed that Tatum had been found dead in the area of Kenilworth Park and Aquatic Gardens in northeast Washington, D.C. Relisha was not found, and the case remains open. If you've made it this far, I want to ask one final comment question, because I think it reveals what each of us believes about systems and responsibility. When a tragedy happens through a chain of missed moments, who do you think should carry the accountability? Individuals, institutions, or both? And what does real accountability look like? Policy change, resignations, prosecutions, funding, oversight? Because the most frightening version of this story is not the one where Relisha's case is unique. The most frightening version is the one where this can happen again. So what can viewers do beyond watching? First, keep her name in circulation. Not as content, as memory. Second, if you ever come across case information in your work, education, shelter services, hotels, transportation, take missing person posters seriously. You never know which detail will matter to someone trying to reconstruct a timeline. And third, if you know something, anything, about where Relisha might have been, or who might have seen her, report it to law enforcement. Even if it feels small, even if it feels late. Investigators can only work with what they receive. Relisha Rudd should be an adult now. That sentence alone is enough to make your stomach sink. It means there's an entire life we can't account for. Birthdays, graduations, friendships, ordinary mornings. An entire future paused in uncertainty. And that's why people still gather. Still post her photo. Still ask the question. Because a child doesn't stop mattering when the news cycle moves on. If you want to keep going after this video, I have another case on this channel that deals with how a missing person investigation can hinge on one overlooked detail. Watch that next. And if you haven't subscribed and you want more careful, respectful deep dives like this, you're welcome to join us. Most of all, wherever you are tonight, say her name once, out loud, so it doesn't fade into paperwork. Relisha Rudd.